But we're glad you're here tonight. We're going to be talking about courage. I think we need to thank Jeremy Hassler for writing the material. I believe that Andy told me that he inherited that from Jeremy, and he did a real good job on the subject of courage. But we're going to be talking about that tonight and looking at it. We were supposed to sing the song, Stand Up for Jesus. But a lot of you look tired and like you don't feel like standing up.
You can't sing that song, sit down.
No, you can't. You can't. That's like Soldiers of Christ Arise. When they'd sing that at the lectureship at Freed Hardeman, they'd started out with several people still sitting, you know, but by the time they got finished, why, everybody was standing up. There's just some songs that are better sung, and most of the time we probably sing a little better standing up than we do sitting down. Brother Jerry Phillips said it has to do with the diaphragm and the breathing and all of that. So I'm sure that that's the case. But let's talk about courage tonight. Let's define it first. What would you say courage is? I'm sorry? Bravery. That's one of the synonyms. Anybody have any others?
Not afraid.
Not afraid. It's the opposite of fear, isn't it? Courage will not necessarily do completely away with fear, but it will help us conquer it and handle it and make it through it. That's what courage is. Courage is said to be the mental or moral strength to venture, persevere, and withstand danger. It'll help us to do those same things in reference to fear or difficulty. You have any difficulties in your life? You ever have any fears? Yeah.
I don't want to take credit for this, but I heard it said that courage is not the absence of fear, but that something is more important than
That's right. I think I read that quote just the other day. Very similar to that. Webster mentions these synonyms: valor, bravery, heroism, gallantry, fortitude, and the antonym for it is cowardice. Being morally afraid to do something that needs to be done. Cowardice. That can be a problem for us as Christians. I ran across this passage in Proverbs 28, verse 1. It's sort of the text for our study tonight. The wicked flees when no man pursues, but the righteous are bold as a lion. We're talking about the lion tonight in the Wizard of Oz movie. It's been a long time since I saw that movie. I do remember watching it with the children when they were small. Don't recall ever watching it with the grandchildren. But there were all these characters, you know, and they all lacked something, and they're walking the yellow brick road, and God want to see the wizard. And they all needed something. And the lion needed courage. Can you imagine a lion needing courage? I saw a cartoon today of a huge lion with his mouth open, and a fellow was bent over with his head in the lion's mouth looking down his throat. I doubt that happened in real life, because lions are known for their ferocity. How many of you have ever been to Beach Bend, up in Kentucky? We made several trips up there when I was in grade school and high school. That was the place to go on class trips near the end of the school year. We went up there, and if you'll recall, they had several animals around through an area, and one was a lion. And sure enough, about 2 or 3 boys were there when a friend of mine and I got there, and they were teasing that old lion. And they found him a stick, and they stuck it under, there was a little opening down at the bottom of the cage. And they started sticking that in there, that lion, and he just sort of looked at them like, you don't know what you're doing. But finally, he had enough. And man, it was so quick, I didn't even have time to respond. I wasn't the one doing it now. Not my friend either. But that lion just, grabbed that stick, and those boys backed up. I was already backed up. But that was my first introduction to seeing a lion in real life, a live lion. And it scared the daylights out of me just standing there watching. The lion is a ferocious thing. But a lion without courage, that's hard to imagine. Here are several quotes. Barry gave us one. Here's some that I found that I thought were interesting. Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. Who would you imagine said that? Go back to World War II. Winston Churchill. Remember, he said, we'll fight you in there, we'll fight you on the land. We're not giving up. And the English people survived. You will never do anything in the world without courage. It is the greatest quality of the mind next to honor. That's from Aristotle. Courage isn't having the strength to go on. It's going on when you don't have the strength. That was Napoleon. The secret of freedom is courage. Thucydides. You know him, don't you? On a first name basis with him. I'd heard the name, but I had to go back and look up who he was. He was an Athenian general. Remember the city of Athens in the book of Acts? He was an Athenian general who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. They were fighting for the dominance in Greece. And it continued for about 3 decades. Long war. But he never completed the 8-volume work that ended in mid-sentence. That last volume ends in mid-sentence in the winter of 411 BC. Well, there's a lot of others, thousands of quotes about courage. But we want to look tonight at what the Bible has to say, and we want to look to a major example of courage. One of my favorite Old Testament characters. 2 of them begin with the letter J. One of them Joseph, the other one is Joshua. Joshua, turn with me to Joshua chapter 1, and let's read a few verses as a basis for our study. Joshua chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. That's a powerful announcement. Joshua, you're about to inherit a leadership role that Moses has filled for a long time. But Moses, my servant, is dead. That's like telling Joshua, Moses is gone. He's not going to come back. This is going to be your task. Listen to what he says. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving to them, the children of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given you, as I said to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, and to the great sea, toward the going down of the sun. That would be the Mediterranean, wouldn't it? Shall be your territory. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you nor forsake you. Now notice these next couple of verses. Be strong and of good courage, For to this people you shall divide as an inheritance the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Verse 7, only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate in it day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. That's one of the great passages of the Scriptures on the subject of courage. 3 times he is told by God, be courageous. Have courage. Don't lose it. He tells him in that last statement, do not be afraid. He's reinforcing it. Courage is not the absence of completely of fear, but you face difficulties with courage. Be not dismayed. Don't be amazed at anything that happens, because I'm going to be with you and you can handle any situation that arises if you'll put your trust in me. I will be with you. He was Moses' successor, but he was faced with a great task, conquering and dividing and settling the people into their new homeland. He would have to divide them into tribes and give them certain territories. So it was going to be a really great task that he was given. Notice he is the son of Nun, N-U-N. He is described as Moses' assistant, but he had now to carry on, and he was a man who would be able to do that. God reveals the borders for the land. He talks about from the wilderness and this Lebanon to the Euphrates, including the land of the Hittites, all the land toward the great sea, toward the going down of the sun. So he was going from east to west, north and south, and telling them the land that they would have. And God promised him that no one would be able to stand before him. Just as Moses had taken on Pharaoh, so Joshua would be able to do what needed to be done to ensure the proper settlement of the land. But those 3 admonitions, to be strong and be courageous, that's very important. There are several other biblical examples of courage. Let's talk about them, and you may be, or some that I've noted, you may have others that come to your mind as well. But Abraham is a great example of a courageous man. He was told by God to leave his homeland and go to a place that I will afterward show you. What would most of us say? I want to know where I'm going. Yeah, I want to know where I'm going and what is there. What's there? Where do you want me to go, Lord? Well, I'm not going to tell you right now. I'm going to show you later on. But Abraham had to have courage in leaving his family behind and going to an unknown territory. But he obeyed God. Second courageous thing that Abraham did was offering his son, wasn't it? That took a lot of courage. What does that tell us about the importance of faith? What is the foundation of courage? In my
that we don't understand the reasons why. If God says do it, then we are to do it.
That's exactly right. Our faith in God will give us courage. Sometimes when we're saying, I can't, God is saying you can. I'll be with you. You know, and if God be for us,
Who can be against?
who can be against us? Abraham is a great example of courage. You can read about those two events in Genesis 12 and Genesis 22. Go back and read some of those scriptures and read them very carefully. You read about Gideon. He's one of my favorite judges, maybe my favorite. He took 300 men and defeated a vast army. God kept telling him, you have too many. The Lord only have this many left now. Surely, no, that's still not enough. Whittled an army of thousands down to how many? 300. I'm going to give you 300 men. And let's see what we can do with 300 men. Nighttime attack, all that, the tactics of warfare were thrown out, The mighty armies would congregate, one on this side of the valley and one on this side of the valley, and they would come and meet each other in the middle to fight. And some of the valleys of Palestine were well known as battlegrounds. But Gideon was told, you only need 300 men.
And God.
And God. But one of the secrets to that success of that story, there's a statement. I preached a sermon on it a long time ago. It's been a long time since I've even thought of this sermon, just came to mind. Every man stood in his place round about the camp. That's one of the kind of hidden quotes in that story. But that is a very significant thing. It's amazing what we can do as the people of God if every person will stand in their place and do what God tells them to do. And so Gideon won that battle. Read about it in Judges chapter 6. The book of Ezra. Go back to that book sometime and read about the fact that he came back from Babylon to Palestine without a guard, evidently without any army round him to protect him or anything like that. That took a lot of courage in that day and age to do. He had to go through some, no doubt, hostile territory, but he made it. That's in Ezra chapter 8. Another favorite story for the young people are the three Hebrew children, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They wouldn't bend, they wouldn't bow, they wouldn't burn. Remember that little song about them? They were very courageous. They said, we're not going to stop serving our God. Don't make any difference what you do to us. We're going to continue to serve Him. That took courage in a strange foreign land where everybody did the bidding of the king. And there were people who could manipulate the king sometimes and get them to write decrees or hand down laws that were designed to hurt certain ones. And that's what happened to these three men and to David, who in Daniel 6 persisted in prayer even though he was told not to do it. He said, I'm going to continue to pray to my God. Now, he didn't defiantly say, well, you told me I can't pray, so I'm going to show you. That wasn't it at all. He had been praying all the time. But he defied the order of the king by continuing to pray to the true God of heaven and earth. Very courageous act. Daniel chapter 3 and Daniel chapter 6, you read about them. Think about Peter and John, who refused to obey men rather than God. They said, we must obey God rather than men. They could very simply have been put to death. But they said, we fear God more than we fear men. Do what you think you have to do to us, but we're going to keep on following what God has said as long as there's breath in them. I haven't read them in a while. Fox's Book of Martyrs talks about the martyrs that died and the stories about them, during the early church, and so many stories that you can find of people who were put in difficult situations. But Peter and John said, we ought to obey God rather than men. That's what we're going to do. And that took courage on their part. But notice, their faith undergirded them, served as a foundation, and they said, here's what we're going to do, come what may. It's really good to have your mind made up ahead of time, as long as your mind is focused on the Bible, focused on God's Word. Now, that'll be a reliable foundation upon which to stand. There's a lot of cases of personal bravery. Joshua and Caleb, who didn't agree with 10 of the other spies, and they were in the minority, but they said, we can take this land. And both of them were rewarded. Joshua with becoming the leader of God's people. Caleb would later be given that mountain, when he was an old man. But he still took care of it. Went to a funeral the other day of Brother Jack Brown. Known him since I was just a small boy. He was about the age of my oldest brother, James Paul. But one of the things that was mentioned about him was that he had been farming a rugged hillside farm in Jackson County. All the rocks and things like that up on Dry Fork, not far from Flynn's Lick and not very far from Nameless. And if you've never been to Nameless, you need to go. But anyway, he farmed that land for years and years and years. He was given, I guess you could say, a sort of a mountain, and he made the most of it. Joshua and Caleb. There's the story of Gideon we've already talked about, the story of Deborah, who led the armies of God in Judges chapter 4. That took courage. The story of David and Goliath. That took courage for David to face Goliath when not even the king himself, who was evidently a great physical specimen, but he was a dwarf beside of Goliath. David said, I'll go meet that Philistine. And he did. And you know the rest of the story. But Esther saving her people, Esther chapter 4. And here's one that was courageous, and we might not even ever think about this when we read about Joseph of Arimathea. Would the Roman authorities smile upon his desire to take the body of Jesus? That was quite a courageous act, to go and request the body of somebody that had just been crucified, because criminals were usually those who had been crucified. How are the authorities going to respond and react? And the apostles, not only just Peter and John, but the others. And the apostle Paul, he was very courageous and always stood for the truth. And there's a statement made in Acts 28:15 that where Paul is on his way to Rome. He's nearing the city, already out of the boat, headed to Rome. And it says that when he saw the brethren, evidently those from Rome, I guess were coming to meet him, he thanked God and took courage. He thanked God and took courage. I think that shows us the relationship, the importance of the relationship between ourselves and God. If we are people of gratitude and we recognize the goodness of God and how wonderful and great He is, then we're going to have faith in Him. More and more people, fewer and fewer people, believe in God in this country and throughout the world. I've got some statistics that I've been using or going to use in another lesson. And it's amazing how that is decreasing within this country. And Matthew and I were talking last night after services, and he was telling me about some of those kids that he was talking about, that they don't even know what a Bible is. He works with special needs kids and kids that have problems. And he really loves those children. And he told me about, he hugged this little boy, and the boy's mother reported him. And so he told her, he said, "Ma'am, I won't touch your child again." And he didn't until the last day of school. The mother came with her child that day, and she saw the difference in her child's life. And so when they started out of the room, she said to the child, "Go back and give Mr. Scoggins a hug." He won the child and won the mother too. Takes courage. Let's look at some passages. I'm going to try not to do what these other speakers have done and run out of time. So I want to cover this material. There's some pointed passages for all of us as Christians. Listen to them and let's talk about them. If you have any comments, be sure to let me know. See if you remember this one. Watch, stand fast in the faith, be brave, be strong. Let all that you do be done in love. Anybody knows where that is? Who knows where that is? 1 Corinthians 16, verses 13 and 14. That's the way Paul closes that first letter to the church at Corinth. Tells them to watch, be on the lookout, be vigilant, be sober. Peter says, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour." Paul repeats that same idea. Stand fast in the faith. You know, get your feet planted there and keep them there. Don't be going to the shifting sands of false teachers and all of that. Be brave. He's telling them, be courageous. Let all that you do be done in love. Be strong, he said too. Philippians 1, 27 and 28. Only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of your affairs, that you stand fast. There's that thought again. That you stand fast in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel, and not in any way terrified by your adversaries, which is to them a proof of perdition. If they're your adversary, that means they're children of destruction. But to you of salvation, and that from God. That's a very beautiful passage, very comforting one. It's a very challenging one. It tells us that we must have courage. 2 Timothy 1, verse 7. For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Christians are sometimes thought to be fanatics. They're thought to be totally out of the loop, to be superstitious people, just people that aren't connected with life. But Paul says God has given us the spirit of power, of love, and of a sound mind. And we must ever strive to keep that so. 1 John 4, verse 18. Perfect love casts out fear. Perfect love casts out fear. What have we learned about the love of God? What about our priorities? What's the first and greatest commandment? Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. That is, with your entire being. Love God. Perfect love casts out fear. So when you put faith, hope, and love together, these are the three greatest things, remember, Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 13. These things will give us courage. And we need to work at developing them in our hearts and lives. Revelation 2. We know Revelation 2:10. Let's put the two verses together, 10 and 11. Do not fear any of those things you are about to suffer. John tells them, you're going to suffer. It's coming. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison. Why is he going to do that? Next statement, that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. It's believed by most that comment on this passage that 10 days refers to a relatively short period of time, but any of you eager to spend the night in jail? We have a deputy here, but he's off duty right now. But I know him well enough that if need be, he would respond to any problem that might arise in our community. But I don't want to spend a night in jail. It's just one night. I've been to the state prison to visit prisoners on occasion. And our people here have heard me, or most of you, I guess, heard me say this at some time or other. But I remember the first time I ever went. And when that door closed behind me as I went in, I did just what the people do in the movies. I turned around and looked back. I mean, that had a sound of finality. That wasn't just a door in my house closing or locking the back door when I leave. I mean, that had a clang to it that sounded permanent. And I sort of whispered to myself, I sure hope that thing will open when I get back out here. And it did. But we talk about all the comforts and conveniences that criminals have in jail. I don't want to be there with all those comforts and things that they supposedly have. Now, you're going to be cast in prison. Some of you, you're going to be put in prison so that you may be tested. How strong is your faith? God tests us sometimes, doesn't he? What does he say in view of that? You will have tribulation 10 days. Follows that immediately with, be faithful unto, not until, unto death. Even if it costs you your life. You be faithful, even if it causes you to be put to death. And who was that said, I regret that I have but one life to give for my country? Who was it? Nathan Hale. I'm sorry? Patrick Henry. I've forgotten. That just came to mind. We'll go back and Google it, find out. All right? But think about that. Giving your life. Is it going to be worth it? Jesus said, and I will give you a crown of life. I think it'll be worth it. And now listen to part of verse 11. He who overcomes, and in my opinion, that's the theme of the book of Revelation. Overcoming, being more than conquerors. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. What's that? The second death. Hell. You're not going to go there. So if you're given the choice between the crown of life and that place called hell, the decision should already be made, shouldn't it? Any comments? I prefer comments instead of questions. There are some situations in life that require and even demand courage. What are some of them? Here's some that I came up with. I want you to add some others. Going it alone. If you have to stand alone for what is right, what are you supposed to do? You do it. Who had to do that? What did Joshua say in Joshua 24:15? He says, if it comes down to it, just me and mine, we're going to serve the Lord. Now, if that sounds evil to you, if that's far out to you, then you go ahead and serve Baal and other gods if you want to. But as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. We will go it alone if we have to. It's difficult to do that, isn't it? It takes courage to do that and to say that. What about Jesus? Who went all the way with him to the cross? Now, I'm not talking about in proximity to the cross. I'm talking about to the cross, on the cross. Who went with him?
Mary and Mary Magdalene.
They were there nearby, but they weren't on the cross with him, were they? They were not on the cross. That's what I'm talking about, going to that cross. And what did he say about his Father? What question did he ask? My God, why have you forsaken me? He went alone. Here's another time that we need courage, when we confront error and sin. We live in a culture where you're not supposed to ruffle feathers. You're not supposed to say anything to stir the water or muddy the water. But what did Paul do when Peter wouldn't have anything to do with the Gentile brethren? He confronted him, didn't he? He said I rebuked him because he needed to be rebuked. Because
we live in a time where that you have to be careful. You could be arrested for rebuking certain things.
that's true, just for saying something out of line. But think about that. Did that mean that Peter and Paul were enemies? What did Peter say about Paul? Or what did Peter say about Paul later on when he wrote about him? And he said, now, Brother Paul teaches some things that really, really hard to understand. But he goes on to compliment him. So Peter didn't get bent all out of shape because Paul rebuked him to the face and before witnesses evidently, and said, Peter, Gentiles have the same right to the gospel as we Jews do. And so, we're brethren. But you're refusing to eat with them, even made Barnabas go back. It affected my friend Barnabas. And so Paul had the courage to rebuke a fellow apostle. What about Nathan confronting David? You think that was an easy task for Nathan, a mere preacher, to go and say to the king, I got something I need to talk to you about. And of course, he did it in a nice way. I mean, that was an interesting little story, wasn't it? About the man that only had the one little ewe lamb. And his neighbor took it to feed his guests, even though he had many sheep. And David said, why, you tell me who that is, I'll put him to death. Nathan said, David, you're the man. And David's sin came home to him. Somebody said that reproof in the Bible means to bring the fault home to the offender, to make the person who has sinned realize this is an offense against God. And maybe you've inflicted damage to your fellow man. You violated the golden rule, all of that. It takes courage to confront error and sin. Look at 1 Timothy 5:20, Titus 1:13. Jot those down and read them later. I have my hearing aids in. Has anybody heard a bell? I haven't, so we're going to keep going. Another situation where we need courage is when we're caught in wrong and we need to confess it and correct it. That takes courage. It's not always easy to say 2, 3 little words. I am sorry. It takes courage to say that sometimes. Would you forgive me? And I'll throw this in. I think Matt talked about it a little last night too. The kids who have never heard those 3 words, I love you. He had told me that story before. They'd never heard those 3 words. He had to teach them how to say them. That's the first bell I heard it. Do you know one of the rarest statements in the Bible consisting of 3 words? I have sinned. That's very rare. If I'm not badly mistaken, those exact words are spoken less than a dozen times. And some of the people who stated them didn't really mean them. King Saul, for example. Finally, using our talents and God-given abilities requires courage. Teaching others, growing and developing in service. Instead of the elders having to ask us, why don't we ask them, what can we do? What more can we do? What needs to be done? Tennesseans are supposed to be volunteers. We're known as the volunteer state. Christians need to be people that do that too. They have God-given abilities. It's always amazed me at how much ability some members of the church have in certain areas, and they refuse to utilize that talent in service to the Lord. We need to rethink that. It takes courage. Let me urge us all, based on Ephesians 4:15, 2 Peter 3:18, to grow in truth and knowledge of the Lord. Work hard at that. Add those Christian graces. And let us always have the courage to do what's right. Anybody in here know Captain Arthur Rostron? He was the captain of a ship in the North Atlantic the night the Titanic was sinking. There were 3 ships in pretty close proximity. One was 7 miles away and could see the Titanic, the lights of it. Captain of that ship said, we can't answer that distress call, because he was illegally killing seals and had a bunch of them on the boat. And he knew that if he went, his illegal activity would be uncovered. So he didn't go. Another one was, I believe, about 16, 17 miles away. A lot of ice around that boat. They said, well, we better not risk this. We'll wait till in the morning. But Arthur Rostron said to the man at the wheel of his boat, turn this ship around. And his ship, I'm not sure I've got the pronunciation on it. It's been quite a while since, Carpathia, I believe. He was 58 miles away. He got there, and they saved over 700 people as a result. He had courage. Let's not make the same mistake that those first two captains made in reference to our duty to the lost and those that are dying in sin. If you're among those dying in sin, you can obey the gospel and become a Christian tonight. Yes, we can take care of it in spite of all the stuff that you see up around the baptistry. We'll baptize you into Christ. If you have done that, but you've become disobedient, we would urge you to be restored through penitence, confession, and prayer. Brother Johnny is going to be leading us in number... All right, say that again. All right. We're going to be singing that song. If you're subject to the invitation of the Lord, please come as together we stand and sing.
And resolved no longer to linger, charmed by the world's delight. Things that are higher, things that are nobler, these have allured my sight. I will hasten to him, hasten so glad and free, hasten glad and free. Jesus, greatest, highest, I will come to thee. I am resolved to enter the kingdom, leaving the paths of sin. Friends may oppose me, foes may beset me, still will I